Right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second installment of the Perspective series hosted by the DG Murray Trust. We have chosen to organize this as a conversation about the role of the food system in escaping the inequality trap. And today we're asking two questions. Firstly, is the food system driving inequality? And secondly, what opportunities can we seize to combat inequality through the food system? In South Africa, we have many policies that should be improving food insecurity and nutrition outcomes, but for too many, that simply isn't happening. It's frustrating and unjust that we aren't making the progress we need to make. This is why we can't keep tracing the same old pathways to development in South Africa. We need bold and decisive twists that get us out of the rut, give fresh perspective, and create new opportunities. And fresh perspectives are precisely why we're here today. So let me start today's conversation by welcoming the panelists and everyone who's watching this morning on LinkedIn Live. My guests are Dr. Jane Battersby from the Department of Environmental and Geographical Science at UCT, Lutfia Suleiman, who is a Mamandla Fellow, and Oxolo Mofokeng from the Siyabona Abalimi Development Center. Oxolo was available at the last minute to replace Mteto Mkungu from the Southern African Food Lab, who was planning to join us, but unfortunately couldn't make it. Fortunately, we managed to organize a stand-in, and I'm delighted to have Oxolo with us. She's worked with Mteto on farmer training in KwaZulu-Natal and will definitely add something special to this conversation. And it's really great to host an all-women panel this morning. So as many families know, let's jump straight to the conversation. The cost of food is a big challenge. Besides the price, it's also about the quality of food that households are able to eat. And we consider both of these, the affordability and the quality question. And we know from nutrition surveys over the years that many adults and children are not consuming enough healthy, nutritious food on a regular basis. And because of this, things like stunting among young children and chronic disease in adults are a real burden in the country. We have good policy on paper, but the way in which they're implemented doesn't reach our goals, or not quickly enough. The inequality in nutrition outcomes is only one side of the story. So I'd like to start by asking Jane to go a bit deeper and wider to discuss the scope of inequality as a way to frame the rest of the conversation. So Jane, thanks again for joining. You are an author of the brand new high-level panel of experts report titled Reducing Inequalities for Food Security and Nutrition. How can this report help us think about inequality in the food system? What new perspective does this report offer policymakers and practitioners? Over to you.
Thanks, Anne-Marie, and welcome to anyone who's tuning in. So we did the high-level panel of experts report last year, recently, on inequalities in food security and food systems. And really the perspective we took was, so we know that there are vast inequalities in food security and nutrition outcomes. There's inequalities between global north and global south. There's inequalities within countries, within regions, and even within households. And these inequalities are experienced intersectionally. So it makes a difference around gender, around youth, around race, around location, and all those things intersect. And so the challenge is, how do we start to unpack that? How do we start to address those inequalities? And the perspective we took within the report was that these inequalities are not natural outcomes. Sure, sometimes there's like a geographic circumstance that makes it harder, but that in itself is not natural. And so these inequalities are the outcome of systemic inequities, systemic injustices. And so we have this framework of this kind of churn of inequity, these multiple things that interact to shape outcomes. So it's about poor distribution and how that interacts with a lack of representation. So where do people's voices come in? How are people recognized politically? And a lack of recognition. So are there groups that are getting excluded that are just not being seen? And so this churn of lack of recognition, lack of representation, and poor distribution kind of shapes inequality at the end, but it's also shaping the food system that's feeding people. So those same inequalities are active in the food system, and then in these other systems that interact. So we think about how things like education, how things like access to land, access to housing, access to water and sanitation, how those things then interact with the food system in the lives of people. And all of these things perpetuate these inequalities, which leaves us with quite a grim kind of vision. But what the report does as well is it then turns that churn of inequity into an engine of equity, and says, okay, but we can move forward, we can transform this system. Firstly, if we understand these linkages and recognize that what we need is a fundamental transformation. But that transformation comes not just through redistribution, because a lot of times with inequalities, we think, well, if we just give a larger social grant, if we just have better targeted programs, we're going to solve the problem. But the report says, no, what we need to do is do that redistribution, but also at the same time, increase recognition to make sure we're speaking to the right people, and increase representation to make sure the voices and experiences of those experiencing those inequalities are brought into the conversation. And so that's kind of what the report tries to do. And so what it ultimately does is it comes up with a set of recommendations, but it says, if these recommendations are to work, you've got to have like an equity vision in whatever policy you're doing. So in all of the policies we're developing, what is the inequality it's trying to address, and what are the underlying inequities? And so we've got to kind of recognize this intersectional stuff. We've got to recognize that this needs to be transformative. It's got to have all those three dimensions of recognition, representation, and redistribution. And then recognizing we need to have alternative and different kinds of voices and data coming in, because so often the analysis that's being done at government level is informed by statistical data, which is sometimes really good, sometimes not so great. But oftentimes the voices and experiences of the people who are actually experiencing inequalities are not incorporated. So it's calling for greater agency within the system, a greater recognition of context, and saying actually everybody is a member of the stakeholder group that's driving this inequality. And so everybody needs to be a part of driving the solutions. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Jane. And just for everybody, just back to real basics, those of us on this call know the definitions of these terms very well, but the food system is a collection of inputs and outputs that are connected broadly from the farm to the consumer. So it's often simplified as it's from the farm to the fork, but it's also all the things that go into that process to help us get food produced and then ultimately consumed and back again. So just to make sure that everybody understands the term, we should have started with the definition. Apologies for that.
Sorry for being a bad academic.
No, it's on me, Jane. So next up, I'd like to ask Otlolo. So exactly this thing about, the food is grown by someone. So can you talk to us a little bit more about farmers and the types of challenges that they face, or how they typically experience inequality? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. Good morning, everyone in the call and to the listeners. First and foremost, I'd like to indicate that we work in rural communities. And if there is one place where this is evident in daily basis, is in rural communities, let alone the fact that there's limited employment in that sector, but also the fact that it's governed by the tribal authority. And in KwaZulu-Natal, it's a different case because we all know culture, sometimes it kind of like favors one gender compared to the other. But then farmers, the biggest challenge that there is on the ground is that we have farmers who are brilliant on the ground growing their produce. But then everyone's mentality, the system, the government, and the country as a whole, we've all planted the seed that says, for one to be successful, you need to have a job. But then now people wait for that job. What about teaching people how to utilize what you have already, and something that won't require you to move places from point A to point B? So when it comes to this topic, in fact, the inequality side and then the farmers' communities, for me, it's more about saying, how can we tackle the fact that there's food scarcity in South Africa? How do we deal with the issue of food? How do we educate people about eating balanced diet? We have land that is not expensive. We can grow it in a homestead. If there's, like, look at the state, number of high malnutritions are coming from rural communities. How do we tackle that? And believing in that, I think that the first thing that we need to bombard at this stage is the media, because we all know media is powerful and everyone is on social media. But how often do you come across a TikTok video with a young farmer in rural communities growing his spinach and cabbages? Let's change that status quo. Who said social media should be about fashion and all these apps that are Photoshop and whatsoever? Let's Photoshop our produce. Let's Photoshop our gardens. Let's show of what we do. We've planted this thing to say, oh, we've enabled people to think being in the agricultural space is kind of like one of those, low scale jobs. It doesn't matter, but that's where the problem is. Let's start from there, because number one, in agriculture, you learn discipline, you learn how to manage yourself. So all those soft skills that you think you will learn in the office, it's something that you can start with at home, unemployed, while feeding your family and your children. By the time you get to the workspace, you already have those skills without having to spend money paying people to teach you that. So for me, nutrition at school, and again, that's something else. We have government schools with feeding scheme systems. Where do they buy that produce? Are you telling me that in those communities, neither of those gogos, elderly farmers, or anyone can be contracted by the school, paid fairly, because that's the other problem in the department, pay them fairly for the value of the produce they bring to you. Let them feed their children while we're supporting their positions in local communities. So the whole government structure, the policies and stuff, it looks good on paper, but what about the reality? And also, if government can't do it, we cannot wait on our South African government, we all know that. But then what are we doing in civil societies to change that and to enable that? Let's start somewhere. Let's take the first steps. They'll meet us halfway if they do, but then let's start the movement together, and then we can make the change.
Great, thanks very much. I think it's a great idea to say, we must disrupt the ways in which we talk about what has value in our lives and put food and food production right up there, because we're all dependent on that. So I love that recommendation. Shifting gears a little bit to Lutfia, I have a question about the effect of the food system. So we know that 1/3 of global greenhouse emissions are generated by the food system, and we're in a country where there is severe energy poverty, and the wealthy are able to buffer themselves. I live in a house with solar. We can buffer ourselves from load shedding, from the severe effects of climate change. And our current solution to energy poverty is also hugely damaging to the environment, burning coal. So how do food systems and energy systems interact? Where do these things meet?
Sure. Thanks, Anna Marie, and thank you also to those listening in and to my co-panelists. So you're right. So, maybe just to start by saying that kind of our greenhouse gas, or I'm going to use the term GHG emissions, from agriculture and the food system as a whole, are not just due to our energy consumption. However, given that our energy mix does remain so coal dominant, and given that even longer haul distribution relies heavily on road transport, often across vast distances, there of course is a significant impact on air quality and a significant contribution to climate change that the food system makes. And of course, the impact of agriculture isn't also limited to emissions, but it also impacts on water use, on land degradation, on pollution, and so on. So understanding kind of the energy usage and energy needs of the South African food system is also complex. Energy inputs are required all along the value chain, from agricultural production, whether it's small scale, whether it's commercial, to transport, distribution, cold storage, processing and packaging, sales, consumption, literally how we cook our food, as well as waste management and your associated food products. So the relationship between energy and food is very complex and multifaceted, and I think we also need to expand it to include water, and to keep in mind the food, energy, water nexus when we're considering kind of the primary and secondary impacts of the energy system on food. But just to highlight kind of 2 or 3 crucial and relevant intersections and relationships right now, I thought I'd look at foremost the relationship between energy access, that's like various forms of energy, and electricity price inflation, and then food price inflation, which is, I think, at the highest it's been in about 14 years, just apart from energy costs. So there are many factors that are contributing to cost inflation that we're seeing, from systemic issues. We know about the corporate dominance and profit motives that drive up costs for inputs such as fertilizer and seed. We are aware of the geopolitical shifts that affect the availability and price of dominant foodstuffs, or feed and so on, with the Russia-Ukraine situation being an example. However, still, the relationship between energy access, and particularly our electricity price, and food prices and consumption patterns is notable. So we see that with the rising cost of fuel and electricity, alongside the other factors I mentioned, has had an impact on the cost of food production, as well as on the transport of goods, including food. And this is contributing to increasing food prices. There's also, at a household level, there's also data, for example, from the Peter Maritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity organization, who produced the Household Affordability Index, that shows us the dire impact of this. When poorer households have to pay more for energy and transport, it is often at the expense of nutritious foods and even basic food items. And then, of course, access and cost of electricity and other forms of energy also determine what kinds of food people are able to prepare and eat. And then secondly, I think I would also just note the impacts of load shedding on food production. I think my co-panelist would also have a lot to say about the impacts on farmers as well. But maybe just to broaden the impacts of energy poverty on well-being and on care itself, in a world that increasingly relies on energy and electricity to function and to provide for care functions within the household, and on the abilities of working mothers and women in particular who perform the majority of this labor. It impacts on the ability to cope and provision the household in the face of inflation and energy insecurity. So load shedding, it impacts on farmers in many ways. It impacts on water management, where water is needed for irrigation, pumping boreholes. It has impacts for dairy farmers, poultry farmers. It has impact on cold storage. But ultimately, this affects productivity, it affects quality, and for many, it's even starting to affect the viability of their farming businesses. And of course, then these impacts are felt most deeply by emerging Black farmers who are already at a disadvantage when it comes to the availability and accessibility of financial support. And farmers who cannot actually weather the increased financial burden of installing renewables such as solar or purchasing a generator and diesel, and then still integrating this private provisioning of energy into their management systems and schedules. And this then has a knock-on effect on workers' rights. It has an effect on their remuneration, it has an effect on precarity on farms, and this is also further deepening inequalities in the food system. And then just lastly, I think I'd mention sort of looking at how energy policy and climate policy and developments in the climate space, especially something like the just transition, may impact on our food system. So, for example, we have the anticipated phasing out of our coal generation with replacing it with renewables. That, coupled with developments and regulations that are governing private generation and distribution, could again mean that those best positioned to survive and thrive, in the economic environment are the commercial and largely white-owned farms, who already have all the access to support and financial resources. Then, of course, there are also, international and national pressures and changes to policy that are driving a low-carbon agenda that may also impact on the market. So we may also see shifting demand for certain products, which will also have impacts on our diets. It will also have impacts on workers in these industries. I think I'll stop there.
Great. No, thanks, Lutfia. I think you've definitely shown that there's such a massive scale of ways in which the food system intersects with many parts of our lives, and it's useful to surface them. Let me go back to Jane and ask, shifting a little bit about thinking how we can use the food system. And so, Jane, I'm curious, do you think that there are twists that we can use or implement to get us to a reformed food system? Not just thinking about silver bullets, or not a one size fits all solution, but is there something in our thinking or in our doing that we can change to reform the food system to overcome inequality?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think what we need to always hold in mind is that the food system is experienced by people, and therefore as people, we have powers to shape and reframe. In South Africa, our food system is incredibly concentrated. There's 5 large retailers who control about 80% of the formal retail market. There are a very small number of millers and processors. So we've got this concentrated system, but we shouldn't think that we're powerless within that. So what I want to do is take us back to a definition, because, I need to do those. But if we look at what food security is defined as by the FAO, right? food security is defined as the state of all people at all times having physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their food preferences and dietary needs for an active and healthy life. That's ultimately what we're aiming for. And we need to do that in a context that has a food system that meets those interests. And at the moment, we simply don't have that. At the moment, the food system is serving economic interests. It's perhaps serving the interests of some elites, but it's not serving the interests of food security. And so if we go back into this framing of food security and say, well, okay, what does food security depend on? Again, the FAO have these 6 pillars, but the high-level panel of experts have these 6 pillars. It's about availability. So we're making sure there's enough. It's about accessibility. Are people able to access the food that's there by economic means, physically, and by social means? So, you know, depending on family members, remittances, other kinds of social access. Utilization, are you safely able to utilize that food? So it's not enough just to have enough money to buy the food. Do you have the conditions within your household that enable you to eat that and get nutritional benefit? How stable is that system? But in the last few years, they've added these two new dimensions. And the one is agency. And agency is about the power you have to choose and the power you have to change in that system. And that moves food security from being something that's delivered from on high to something that is actually linked to a rights-based framework, which is we have the right to food in South Africa. We've yet to see a right to food case really make it to court and be followed through. So nobody's really tested it. But food security definition says that agency is this really important component. And then the final dimension that's been added is sustainability, saying this food security is only achievable within a sustainable food system, which links to what Lutfi was saying and Apollo was saying earlier, but also socially sustainable, economically sustainable. And so we've got to kind of build any food security and food system response in the context of how do we increase agency and how do we increase sustainability. And so here we go with this. So where's the twist? What do we do? A couple of things. One is about the data that's feeding into the system, right? And so we kind of have an understanding of what the system looks like and how it works by the kinds of data that are in. And as I said earlier, there's other kinds of narratives that need to come through. And actually the Peter Maritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Project, the acronym is really complex. That data isn't actually accepted by government. They only want to use their official statistics. And there's such richness in that stuff, right? And a lot of the work we've been doing is much more qualitative, trying to understand those linkages in people's lives. That often hasn't been acknowledged, although in the Western Cape and the city of Cape Town, they are starting to incorporate those kinds of data. So I think there's an important thing about the data that helps us to understand and respond, and that can be a twist, right? I mean, I'm a researcher, I'm going to say data is important, but I think it changes the story, it changes the narrative, it changes the entry points. The other thing that comes through, and this links to a question that is in the chat that Agnes from Priceless asked, about how do we include the voices? And I think that's, you know, this agency point. A couple of the projects I've been involved in Cape Town have focused very extensively on building community voice. So there's a group called Food Agency Cape Town that is a group of co-researchers from communities in Fuleni, in Khayelitsha, Gugs, Athlone, etc. And they have taken data that they co-generated and are using this to have community dialogues and are now linking with the University of the Western Cape's community of practice on food governance as part of the Food in Bizo, and they are now driving the conversations. And those are conversations that policymakers come into. Another project that I was working on, the Nourished Child Project, which was all about trying to understand these linkages. And with the things you were saying about the interlinkages between energy and water and what people's food choice are, we did this work, and out of that work emerged this group called the Massey Ambassadors, which is a community-led organization. They've got some external funding to keep them going. I'm not sure I'm allowed to name the donor, but Anna Marie. Yeah, so DG Mary Trust is supporting this. But this is a group of youth ambassadors from Massey who are driving the food conversation in that community. They're doing nutrition education in schools and ECDs. They're doing gardens. They're working with the elderly, but they're also finding ways to speak back to their ward councillor and speak back up to the city. And so, you know, a quick example, one of the first things they did was they realized that the informal traders are really important, but they often got shut down by environmental health officers because they're not compliant. But the non-compliance was never really that well understood. So one of the first things they did was invited the environmental health officers to speak to them so that they could really understand and then communicate back to the informal traders to help them to reach the compliance. So they could be an inclusive part of the solution. So I think there's a lot of scope for, if we start to think about generating new kinds of data that generates agency, we can start to see change from below. There's also change from above, and I'll get to that in the next question. Great.
No, thanks, Jane. That's such a rich response to the question. So Lutfi, I'd like to go back to you and say that, you're a researcher, but you're also a mother, and your work has explored how gender plays out in the food system. And you alluded to some of this earlier, but can you tell us a little bit more about that intersection between gender and food system inequalities, please?
Sure. Thanks, Anna-Marie. And I'm also very intrigued by what Dr. Battersby has mentioned around kind of like the kinds of data and the kinds of information, and I think I'll reference that again later. But just maybe to start by saying that gender inequities are pronounced across the South African food system. They impact at various levels, from food production, distribution, access. And of course, we know that these inequalities are deeply rooted in apartheid. They are also part of our colonial legacy. And importantly, access to land and to water resources remains very limited. A stat we can look at there is the fact that Black women control access to just 1% of the country's agricultural water resources. So women's participation in their ownership and the realizable economic benefit that we get from agricultural production in South Africa is very limited. We see also, for example, that in South Africa, that livestock farming and ownership is still very male dominant, despite being an important form of income for many in the country. We also see that rights violations continue to be the norm for those who are involved in precarious work, both formally and informally. Here, I'll give reference to the work that, for example, the Women on Farms project is doing, where they highlight the realities for women in agricultural production, where women make up a greater proportion of informally and precariously employed workers. They also highlight the conditions on farms that are exacerbating rights violations, such as poor access to housing, insecure tenure, unfair contracts, no contracts. They're looking at the struggle for a living wage, the struggle for equitable and fair remuneration. And all of this intersects with what we term in research circles as the disproportionate impacts of climate change on women. It's a bit of a removed term, but nonetheless, especially what we see the impacts being for Black women living in rural areas. And research is now also showing that climate stress, heat stress, disasters, droughts, flooding, all also impact our food systems negatively. And this, combined with the existing economic and social crises, exacerbate gender-based violence. And of course, this is all worsening existing gender disparities in food security and agricultural productivity.
Absolutely. And I've read papers, sorry to interrupt, but I've read papers that
sure.
even rising temperatures have an effect on women whilst they're pregnant, and it affects the growth of their babies when they're born, and increases the rate of low birth weight, which is a predictor of both stunting and overweight in the South African context. So these things really do intersect in such diverse ways. So I guess the question then is, what can we do differently for caregivers and women from what we're doing right now? What do you think are some of the key things we need to shift?
I'm gonna kind of, I'll talk it out at a higher level. There are many theoretical and kind of practical shifts that we need. We need stronger rights-based policy and governance shift to drive change in our economic and social systems. We need an intersectional approach. We need to prioritize gender justice. We need to prioritize reproductive justice, in order to achieve an equitable transformation. But I have to say, for those who are workers and mothers in our food system who are actually experiencing the marginalization and neglect most profoundly, the policy and governance space is not necessarily kind of a beacon of change. I think that there have been a lot of stalled processes, unfulfilled promises. And I think that this kind of points to the need for a more integrated and community and movement-driven strategy at the various levels. there are those doing important work to address the kind of questions, you know, from whom I would take the lead. Again, the Women from Farms project mentioned earlier, looking at addressing land rights, land redistribution, pushing for improved implementation of workplace regulations, you know, to improve working conditions. But just something you mentioned there around women and birth, and what I would like to bring in is just the question also of breastfeeding, you know, and especially as it relates to infant nutrition and caregiving and maternal well-being. You know, this is where a lot of my kind of independent work is focused since becoming a mum. And again, just to speak to what you said, to speak to what my co-panelist has said, you know, to highlight that the shifts that we need are deep, they are interconnected. Women have become disenfranchised from their own rights and their own bodies in this narrative. You know, we need to kind of rethink how we value women and women's labor and women's bodies in our society. You know, when it comes to mothers' rights and infant nutrition, we kind of think that it starts at the moment after birth where the baby is put to the breast. But, you know, how this progresses, the success of breastfeeding starts in pregnancy. It starts a long time before it starts. You know, if we want to continue it, we have to look at the workplace. And we also need to address the various modes and faces of the medicalization of birth, you know, the enduring legacy of apartheid, you know, in their provisioning and under-provisioning of healthcare services. You know, for example, we know that increased rates of C-sections are also associated with lowered rates of breastfeeding initiation. So we need to kind of look at these issues from an intersectional perspective. We need to interrogate them from a rights-based perspectives, and we need a bit of like, you know, we need to look at the support measures that we are offering at various scales to mothers, to women, and kind of reframe how we are understanding the issues as well, I think.
Great. Thank you so much, Lutfia. I know many researchers are pushing for the recognition of breastfeeding as the first food system that a child interacts with. So really that we see it from farm to fork, but there's also this really intimate relationship between a mother and a child, and that is their introduction to the food system. So thanks for bringing that up.
Sure.
So I'm going to move now to Otlolo, and I'm going to ask you two questions back to back. So the first question is about young people. And so often there's this stat about the average age of farmers in South Africa being over 60, which is really scary if you think about who's actually producing the food and who will be producing food in 20 years' time when 60-year-olds are 80 and maybe aren't as able to work fields anymore. So what can we do about this issue of getting young people interested in agriculture? What could this unlock, do you think?
Okay, thank you, Anne-Marie, for the question. Wow. For me, I would say, yes, that's true. The statistics are true. And over the past 12 years of existence at Siavona, we've been trying by all means to attract young people to the agricultural space, which we have failed, I would say, learned lessons that did not materialize to what we're expecting. So what we realized is that young people are interested in farming. The thing is, they don't have patience of like that patience to wait 4 months before I get my payment, or maybe my produce is being paid for. So in a way, what we need to do, this is urgent and it needs to be done immediately. We need to find ways on how we transfer those skills, because as we've said, farmers are at the ages of 60 and 80 and 80 years, and we don't have any upcoming young farmers. But how do we transfer those skills from those elderly farmers to the young farmers? And yes, we've tried a number of methods, like we have books written, and only God knows that only a few are being read. And at the same time, we're seeing less of that in our media again. But then what other measures can we put in place? Like currently at Siavona, we have a program where we pay a young farmer with an elderly farmer, where that farmer goes to that young farmer's garden and assist and support and mentor and transfer skills. So that alone keeps the youth interested, because they know, oh, okay, now this is what I have to do. This is what I've been taught, but now how do I do it better? Because now what we see is that they are kind of like excelling in the work that they do, and at the same time it's interesting for them. They will tell you that, you know, every morning I wake up and the first thing I want to see is my garden, and when I harvest my produce and I realize that, did I really grow this myself? So there is interest, but it's a matter of us planting the right seeds and putting the right supporting measures in place for them to keep going while they're still learning. To a point that with the program that we're working with now, we have about 5% of them who have come up and said, you know what, I thought I would never be a farmer, but this is of interest to me and I want to go further, I want to do more. What else can I do to grow? And I think we need to have ways on how now, because we filled with the books, not in inverted commas, we filled with them reading books. We know that when it comes to agriculture, media is not in that space, but then now, how can we do it on the ground? How about we really take this thing to the next step to say, okay, let's link you to someone, let's have someone mentoring you. While you're doing that, we need to recognize the mentee and we need to recognize the mentor while they're learning. Take it as what I would say knowledge transfer model or knowledge transfer program where we do that linkages, and not only in the agricultural space, I would even say in livestock, in sewing. You know, we have gogos who've been making pinafores for years. They've never went to school to do that. Who said that for you to do that, you need to be a designer of some sort and have a 3-year degree? They've been living off it for years, feeding their families from that. So we need to look at what existing skills are they bead making, you know, with the arts. They used to make beads. Who's doing that now? So let's look at the skills that we have in our communities and say, how do we transfer these skills to the youngsters in that community? And then we can scale it from there. The one question that I've been asked a number of times is that, oh, how do you work with young people in agriculture? They don't want to get their hands dirty. Even the farmer said in the beginning, they don't want to farm. But guys, let's stop labeling our upcoming leaders, because it seems like we've put them in a box. Let's break those walls. Let's let them come up. Let's meet them halfway. Let's understand their challenges where they are, and then let's try to meet each other halfway and solve the world crisis that we have today, because they are the only solution that we can really depend on and count on, that all these issues will be saved.
Great. No, I'm personally very inspired by the work that you do, and the exchange between an older person and a young person. I think that relationship is so precious. If you think about people growing up without close families and losing those links, that maybe this person can fulfill a role that used to be filled by grandparents and great aunts and great uncles. And so there's something special also about community when you do this mentoring program. So Otlola, next, you said earlier you are working in rural communities. You're in the south coast of KZN. What is it about working in rural spaces that's so exciting to you? Why do you get up in the morning and do the work that you do, where you do it?
Okay, I hope that I'm audible enough, because it seems like there's a little bit of
Yep, I can hear you.
Connectivity issue, but I hope you can hear me. Oh, Anne-Marie, Jesus Christ, I love everything about working in rural communities. You know, if there's one thing that we know about in South Africa is Ubuntu. And for one to experience that Ubuntu fully, you must go to rural communities. I'll just share something like one of the organization's principles. Our staff members, we're not allowed to even to have a juice at the farmer's house. You know, sometimes when they say, oh, Otlola is coming, they'll start slaughtering chickens. They've said, but no, we're not allowed to do that. So that spirit of Ubuntu and giving, you know, the rural community, like rural community people are givers by nature. But then now it's so easy for us to take, but then at the same time not really do something or give back to them. So the spirit of Ubuntu and the fact that the community as a whole work together to uplift their community. For like instance, with the youth program, we found that a participant is linked with this farmer and she's struggling. They will all step in and say, but then if she's rude to you, if she's mean to you, let me take her over and see what I can do. So they don't give up on youngsters. They will take any measures in place to ensure that they support that individual. And that's one thing that we've lost as a society, as a whole, in urban areas. And the fact that, you know, they cheer they cheer us on as youngsters. They cheer everyone on to say, you did not have time or opportunity to do this, but we want you to succeed. We want you to learn. Like you would see them teaching them on how to use the hoe in the garden, and you will laugh when you see it, because we don't understand. At our age, we used to do this every morning at 6 o'clock with my granny, and here you are, 20-year-old, you can't do it. But then it's coming from a point of life. So rural communities for me is my safe space. If you want to give me a best day in the office, tell me to go to the field, which I'm looking forward to doing on Tuesday. The wisdom that you will get, and the support that there is. But anyway, I think while we are on that topic, I also want to mention something that maybe as the panel and the listeners we should think about, is the fact that yes, we're all focusing on rural communities because that's where the immediate solution is required. But we have another crisis coming in townships. There's a lot of unemployment in the country, and people, and I believe that there was a question as well about how to introduce farming in urban areas. As much as we're doing this, but let's not forget about that, because in the next 5-10 years, that will be a disaster. It's coming to a state where it's a crisis. There's no farming space. Yes, there are other methods that we can do to support that. And again, we're so focused on Black people being disadvantaged. That's the truth, we all agree. But let's be honest to say that we have other people of other races who are struggling at this very moment in those townships with no support, and everything that we do, we all say, okay, let's support Black people, but what about them? It's kind of like we're reversing the apartheid cycle to this generation to say, oh, it was you then, now it's now. But then remember, we always say, what we're experiencing now in racism and so forth, it was our forefathers, it was our grandmothers. It's okay, it happened, but we need to work together as a community to say, we're not only ticking boxes to say Black people and so forth, we're all in this together. The economy does not care if you're Black or you what, but we're all in this crisis together. Let's kind of like come together and resolve it wholeheartedly, not just picking places, because townships is like the township in a community like that, environment as a whole is getting to a stage where it's disastrous for anyone to manage. But let's stop that before we get to that stage.
Great. Thanks very much for that answer. And have fun on Tuesday when you're in the field. So Jane, you've worked a lot in urban spaces. And so you've worked with policy in the urban space. You've commented on national policy and how that is transferred to a city space. So specifically in Cape Town, like you mentioned earlier, you've been doing work on food system reform and agency building for many years. What do you think makes it work? Why have you had some successes?
Thanks, Anna-Marie. I smile a little bit about some successes because it's always difficult to tell how much progress we've actually made. But at the moment, we seem to be in an ascendancy moment. I was thinking about national policy and thinking about local policy. And, you've said a few things about, the food system as being everything from farm to fork. And at the moment, national policy, farm to fork and everything in between, I think is a phrase you might have actually used. And national policy seems to think farm to fork and nothing in between, right? So it's got a focus on production, it's got a focus on consumption and kind of nutrition support. So Department of Agriculture is really prevalent, Department of Health is really prevalent. But all of those things, I mean, the kinds of things that Lutfi was talking about earlier around the energy, the kinds of systems that are trying to get the food. There's a question or a comment in the box from Stephen Shoshana talking about the need to really have intentional food movements in linking rural and urban. And so much of that's absent. So I think there's a lot of unsystemic thinking about food systems that happens at the national scale. We've been really quite lucky at the city scale to be able to work with the City of Cape Town, who are trying to push the agenda a little bit. And so, the question about urban agriculture and townships, I fully agree. I mean, I work in urban areas. South Africa's already like 60% urban, and those figures are going up all the time. We know that food insecurity is concentrating in urban and peri-urban areas as much as it's in rural areas. And for a long time, the only policy response was around urban agriculture. And we saw a lot of projects not working. A lot of government funded projects simply failed. And it's because they didn't necessarily think about how that urban agriculture fits into a bigger food system, or how that urban agriculture fits into the urban system itself, and are kind of applying rural practices and knowledge systems to urban without modifying. So what we've been quite lucky in is having a city at the moment that's trying to think systemically. And one of the things about urban is that it is actually the point at which government is closest to the people. And so there is more of a chance for people's voices to come back in. But it's also more of a space where departments can speak to each other. So what we see at national is often very siloed. So this is our problem, this is our mandate, this is your problem, this is your mandate. What the City of Cape Town's done is actually mapped out all of the mandates and all of the programs of the city and looked at where they interact with food, which is quite a radical approach, because it's almost saying, well, you know what? Ultimately, transport policy is food policy, housing policy is food policy. All of these things are shaping food. So let's try and get that big picture, because it does a couple of things. Firstly, it means that when you roll out a food policy, you kind of have a little bit better of an understanding about why things might work or might not work. So it prevents you kind of investing in stuff that's not going to fly, and helps you design those programs better. Or it also provides this, kind of opens up this space for thinking about a bit more of a food in all kind of approach. And again, if we're saying that food is a right, we've got to recognize that we have multiple rights in South Africa. And one of those is the right to city, one of those is right to water. And so all of those, they can't be divided from each other. And so having these kind of integrated conversations seems to be where we're starting to get some traction. Another thing the city's doing is they've held a number of internal kind of processes. Things like, I mean, they've just released an internal report, so it's not out to the public, but looking at, okay, so what happens with stage 8? How does it affect all of the work of all of the departments, and how does it affect the food system? So that kind of systemic thinking is starting to feed its way in. What it's doing in terms of actual food security outcomes is less clear for now, but I think what's really important is doing that groundwork to really understand the system and to really understand what's driving those inequalities. So going back to where I started with representation, recognition, and distribution, how do we start to unlock that? And to me, there's more potential for doing that at the urban scale, because the departments tend to work more closely together, and because there's this closer relation to civil society. So watch this space.
Great. No, thanks, Jane. That's great. And I hope that there are examples from other cities in the country where we're also seeing that. We've been funding a project in eThekwini that's also trying to support small-scale farmers and nutrition access. So kind of trying to increase the production of healthy food, and at the same time trying to convince communities to buy from their local farmers to improve their nutrition. So I don't know if you know of any other examples outside of Cape Town and Durban.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, City of Joburg's had some interesting food programs along the way, and they ebb and flow with politics. So, but there have been some innovative efforts up in Joburg, but also in some of our secondary cities, right? So we know there's been kind of a set of engagements, certainly in Worcester, in the Western Cape, with quite in-depth research being done by institutions, and then learning journeys being undertaken by provincial government and local government. So Breeda Valley Municipality is now incorporating food into its IDP for the first time in a meaningful way. So there are these glimmers of hope, and it's not just the big metros. There are also these pockets of innovation within our secondary and smaller towns.
Great. Thanks very much, Jane. So we've come to the final question to the panel before we open for questions. We've got 10 minutes left on the clock. So Litvia, as a donor, we often say, like, we can't compete with government's money. So let's look at where money comes from, and so much when we're thinking about climate change now, there's this conversation about donor funding coming for just transition projects. So how can we, working in the food system, make space for food system or a just transition in the food system as part of the bigger just transition conversation, so that we ultimately get better nutrition outcomes, we safeguard planetary health, and we improve gender equality?
Yeah, no, thanks Anna-Marie for that question. I think this is possibly the most challenging question to answer. And again, it's kind of one of those high level questions, and I think it speaks a little bit. I was quite interested also to hear about the kind of systems thinking that is taking root in policy spaces, and I think that's quite encouraging. And again, just kind of just to mention that, when we're looking at the just transition in South Africa at the moment, the just transition narrative is very mitigation focused. And that also, our funding, the just transition funding, is also very mitigation focused. If we look at the just energy transition investment package, or the JET IP, for example, that really is focused on transitioning certain, decommissioning certain power plants and kind of stimulating various parts of the economy to transition away from coal. There's also a little bit on transport, and there's a very small percentage that is geared towards skills development that may possibly maybe not even feed into anything related to the food system. So kind of what we're looking at the moment in the climate and just transition space is that there's a very small focus or no focus on food systems. And so that's the challenge, outside of energy concerns, measures for building resilience and adaptation in the food system, it's not really well funded. Adaptation is not something that's well funded globally, because it tends to be associated with higher risks. It tends to be associated with a lower probability of return, So if we're looking again from a climate perspective, we may want to push for climate finance that supports more adaptation and adjustment in our food system. We may want to look at ring fencing certain funds that are coming through. We may want to look at the conversation around reparations and how can that be linked to funding streams for adaptation and ultimately our food systems. We also want to look at the kind of funding that we're getting. A lot of the funding is not necessarily, it's not grant funding. Most of it is not grant funding. A lot of it is debt. And we need to address that issue of debt as well, separately and connectedly, to kind of see transformation. And then I think just ultimately we need to challenge the economic system that entrenches the norms, that entrenches the violence that we kind of see in our food system. And we need to expand the thinking at local and national scales around how can we speak, and maybe it's also got to do with the conversation around data and prioritization and valuing. How can we motivate for greater inclusion of the agricultural food production, but not just production, but food system as a whole in funding streams. What we do also see currently with funding within the agricultural sphere is that it tends to favor approaches that don't necessarily advocate or prioritize justice or rights-based frameworks, as much as it's a just transition. Funding doesn't necessarily prioritize, rights, the supporting and ensuring rights. And then I think, much like the energy and climate sector, where, especially in the face of what kind of seems to be an almost certain wide-scale privatization of energy provisioning, we see the call from various groupings for socially owned renewables or socially owned renewable transition. And I think a key part of any just transition for food will be an increasingly social, but also socialized approach to food production that prioritizes things like we've discussed: gender justice, workers' rights. And then I think, for those of us working from a climate space, working in the climate space, we do find ourselves asking, how can the climate crisis and this notion of a just transition be an opportunity for some of these shifts? Can the emphasis on justice bolster our prioritization of gender justice? And can the momentum for social ownership and community-driven efforts and community-driven movements drive policy review and implementation in the right direction to support kind of these funding streams? But yeah, it's a challenging question, and it's a big question because it's got to do with what's happening far beyond our borders at a global scale as well.
Thanks very much, Litvia. So we're now in the final 5 minutes, and I see there's one question in the chat from Enid asking if there's anyone focusing on what's working in food systems in other countries. And I wonder, Jane, if you may answer this question based on your work with international panel on the new report. Just a brief 2-minute reply, please.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, there's plenty of stuff that's being done. So In a lot of countries, there's quite a lot of, and we're just getting some good labeling legislation coming, well, some labeling legislation coming through in South Africa, but a lot of focus on labeling, on regulation of less healthy foods, of trying to have a justice lens onto that. There's been a lot of work on kind of developing agroecology as a principle. There's some work on transparency along the food value chain. So there's certainly work that's coming out from multiple places. In a lot of North American cities, there's quite a lot of focus on food justice entities and kind of building civil society engagement. So, I mean, I can reel off a list of examples from elsewhere. There is a lot of potential. I think one of the challenges is that we need to understand context, right? And so we can't just pick up something that's worked in Brazil, which is what's been tried before, and plonk it in South Africa and hope it's going to work. We need to learn from the principles that have been built around why those things have been done and how they've understood the system and interacted. So I think we can gain encouragement from some of the stuff that's happened elsewhere, but we need to think about what it means to try and apply those in our local contexts.
Okay, thanks, Jane. I'm not seeing any other questions, so I'm going to take that as the end of the question session. I know there's a bit of a delay, so apologies if we're missing your question. But in recognition of everybody's time, let's wrap up the conversation today. And thanks again to the panelists for your wonderful responses. So like we've mentioned many times today, there's the organization, the Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Group, who produce the Household Affordability Index. And every month they send a press release, and it's just been sent, I think, on Wednesday this week. And every month I go to the section that looks at the gap between the cost of feeding a child a nutritious diet and the child support grant. And for years, we've been arguing in civil society and in academia that the child support grant must be increased so that it is at the level of the food poverty line as a bare minimum. But this hasn't happened yet, and there's still a big gap. And so in response to this, DGMT and Grow Great launched a campaign to close the food gap. And we're asking the private sector and government to come together to enable more families to afford some basic best buy food items. You can find out more about this campaign on our website. We're putting the link in the chat now. And there's also a WhatsApp line that has tips for families. So you can share our call to action and tools for how to manage the food gap using the resources that we've developed. There are some nice recipes. There are all kinds of tools to help you use these best buy products that are fairly easily available. And remember, these best buys don't include any fresh fruit or vegetables, and they are absolutely part of a healthy, balanced diet. So support your local growers and buy fresh food and vegetables from the producers in your community. Thank you all very much for your time today. It's been lovely to share this panel with you. Thanks again to the panelists and to everybody who's joined us. Goodbye.